Hi everyone, welcome to Konveyor Meetup. Today we have Jermaine Edwards from IBM who will be presenting. And in terms of announcements, we really only have a couple. So we did record and publish the community roadmap for all the Konveyor tools last week. We sent out an email with the recording and it is now live on YouTube. Aside from that, if you're not already part of the Konveyor community, but you want to get updates and invites to these meetups and also just announcements on any new features that we have for our tools, please go to Konveyor.io and just subscribe to the mailing list there. And with that said, Jermaine, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. And also, thank you for inviting me and having me. So let me share my screen. Okay, and before I get started, I would like to thank everyone who's joined the call because I know it's actually during the daytime where, with the way things are, everybody is on call. So just taking, hour out, basically an hour out of your day to basically join the session. So today's session will be about modern security pain points with app modernization. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about like lessons learned, and not just talk about what the problems are, but like potential solutions that what I've seen that's worked with different clients that I've gone through. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about myself. Let me go on screen show mode. All right. So my name is Jermaine Edwards. I'm a IBM Distinguished Engineer, and I'm the Global Move and Build CTO for Cloud Application Services. So basically what that means is I basically drive strategy and direction for our GBS group, which is basically our consulting and advising group within IBM. I've been with IBM going on 23 years. My focus area is on cloud. So it's like cloud, what they call digital transformation, where it's not just technology where we are transforming, but also basically the ways of working, how we're organized, things like that. I do have 5 patents, and out of the 5 patents, 2 are security related patents that I have. I focus on system integration as well. And last but not least, I've done quite a few projects where, you see SSO, the first thing that comes to mind is single sign-on. But basically, SSO in my world basically means simplified sign-on, which means that it's simplified in a way that there may be some sign-on, maybe once or maybe twice, but it just is how do I provide a seamless experience for the end user. Now the question is, what are we going to discuss today? Now, when I was going through and preparing the deck, I want to actually approach this a little bit different because a lot of times, you've been on meetings where, there's material just presented, but I actually want to make it a little bit more hands-on as well. So the gist is for today's session, there's 2 core items I'm going to discuss. One is called the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Stand for CIA for short. And you might hear another term called the triad security model. The next one is modern user and service authentication. And the last but not least is we're going to actually do some examples, application security by examples. So the first thing we're going to do, because actually I do have my stand-up desk. So the first thing we're going to do is our stretching exercise. So before I actually talk about the pain points and the lessons learned, let me just actually highlight in terms of, what does it mean when you hear the word confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And sometimes when you see CIA, especially here in the States, sometimes folks think of a Central Intelligence Agency, but that's not the model that we are subscribing to. For this session, we are referring to CIA in the terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, You may say, well, I'm not a security expert. Is there something that I can actually start with? And I believe this model is actually a really great model to actually start with in terms of just remembering what, CIE stand for. So if I pick on confidentiality, there's four core areas that that basically focus on. One is privacy. The next thing is data confidentiality or encryption. The third is authentication. The last is authorization. Now you may say, well, what about AAAs? Where does that, where does that fall in? Where does that play? Well, the gist is that that last A, which is part of the AAAs, in terms of either accounting or audit, that basically falls into this next box or the next column. It's called integrity. So integrity deals with in terms of information integrity, security related events in terms of like recording, and the last but not least is availability. So you may say, well, Jermaine, why is availability part of security? Well, guess what? When there's denial of service attacks and it brings a system down, that system is no longer available anymore. So this deals with in terms of information availability as well as system availability. So in this case here, the system in terms of for processing and the data in terms of making it available. Now, let me go into what I call some lessons learned within each one. So let me start with confidentiality. Now, on some previous projects, one of the biggest things that was going through when we was going through modernization was, how do we deal with GDPR compliance in terms of having the right to basically either retrieve the information about yourself or provide the option to basically delete data about yourself. The next one that we ran into that was a pain point is application trust model, or what we call microservice or microservice security. So for example, depending on which environment that you're coming from, so for example, I ran into scenarios where we was basically on, for example, Cloud Foundry. And, how do you actually start dealing with security, within that type of environment, And if you think about it, there's different types of modes of authentication or basically building trust. But we're going to actually get a chance to talk about that in the next few slides. The next thing that we ran into was health endpoint security. And I actually got a demo of this one to basically highlight, what that actually entails. The next one deals with application credentials and secret management. And you may say, well, this is an old problem. This is always, there's documentation on it. Even though there's documentation on it and, there's tools now that actually scans the code, for example, even Git, gives you like a little warning that there's just say credentials in the code. I still see time and time again that we still have credentials within the code. And we don't really have a way of actually managing it, either based on either we don't have the tools or depending on like our journey in terms of maturity. And the last but not least is certificate management. So on this one project that I was on, one of the biggest things that the client said was his biggest pain point was certificate management. In other words, when the certificate expires, there was always a scenario for an outage. So you may say, well, can I mitigate that by, having emails that basically send notifications ahead of time? But as you know, if you're on projects, that emails tend to get stale. Sometimes I don't know about you. Sometimes my emails get filled up with a lot of emails, so that email might actually get missed. So it just has been several scenarios where there's outages because a certificate has expired. So I'm going to go to the next one in terms of integrity. So when we talk about integrity, this is where we look at, for example, cores, cross-scripting. How do I account for security information event management? So for example, if I have an old system, not an old system, but just say I have an existing system, there's probably some solution today to basically collect like different security events like login, events associated with transactions. But the thing is, when you start going to the cloud, are you able to leverage those same tools, for basically to leverage the same type of security information event? You may hear the other term called SIM, but it just is, can you leverage the same tools for like event management, when you actually go to the cloud? And the last but not least is log retention. A lot of times clients actually have built-in, we'll just say homegrown solutions where they basically retain logs that's on-prem. And this could be, several terabytes of storage. It just says, what does that look like in the cloud? And actually, how do you account for that? What type of solution? And then in addition to that, sometimes you have to look in terms of what is your log management system? Because sometimes your log management system might actually have an option for log retention. Okay, next one is availability. So this is what I was talking about earlier around, for example, denial of service attacks. And you may be asking in terms of why is circuit breaker on here? Well, a perfect example is, one of my clients did a global deployment. And when they did a global deployment, the application, there was a problem with the deployment where the application kept doing like a heartbeat check. And this global deployment actually had like several thousands, clients. And when the client was doing like these retries and retries, it almost seemed like it was a denial of a service attack, but it really wasn't. But if we actually would have had circuit breakers in place, would actually help mitigate in terms of not having our system available. So let me get into modern user and service authentication. So this falls under the C for confidentiality. Now, for end user authentication, I'm going to highlight just 5, even though there are some additional ones like NTLM, Spinago, certificate based, etc. But when we talk about end user authentication, especially for modernization, there's basic auth, basic authentication. We have form based, we have SAML, we have OAuth2, we have OpenID Connect or OIDC. Well, the reason why it's important because when you're doing modernizations, you have to evaluate in terms of what type of authentication your current system is leveraging and what is going to be in terms of like your target state and what type of integration that you're going to do, like what I call like in coexistence, because your integration or your modernization may take some time. Are you going to do a big bang? Or are you going to actually try to do something like a coexistence where there's some like layer or something that support like some immediate, authentication between your old and new. So for example, if I'm doing form-based authentication and just say that my new solution is doing more of a OpenID Connect, how do you reconcile? How do you actually deal with the integration of the two? And actually within my demo, I'm going to actually highlight, several things. Now let's get to the fun conversation. Let's get to the service authentication. Now, service authentication, we have IP whitelisting, custom headers, basic auth, basic mutual TLS, OAuth2, OIDC, and they have this new one called Spiffy, which is really used, well, it's most commonly used within service mesh, but it's actually able to use different authentication methods like cert-based or job-based, et cetera. But one of the things you have to evaluate when you're dealing with service authentication is you have to evaluate in terms of how do you build trust between your components. So for example, if I'm going to the cloud, how can you trust the IP whitelisting? Do you trust the IP is coming in? Because most time when you're in the cloud, the IP is coming from like a proxy header. And, there's ways to actually circumvent that. So the gist is, do you really trust the IP whitelisting, just say the procedure, the process, with that? The next thing is custom headers. I've seen it, for example, for those who have done like, I can pick on like Akamai. There's some solutions where you can actually leverage, Akamai and some custom header, which is they use custom headers, but they actually use like more of they use a standard process, but it is a custom header to basically do like authentication for like some tight integration. Then you have your basic authentication. A basic authentication is more point to point. In other words, like if I have, just say I have an account service, and then I have another service called transfer service. Both of those services are basically point to point. I can't actually, leverage one authentication across the other. The other one is mutual TLS. Now this has matured a lot. So in the past, mutual TLS, one of the pain points was, you had to basically manage, this PKI or this private, key infrastructure. You had to worry about expiring certificates and things like that. But now with the advent of automations and with the DevOps, you can actually automate a lot of these steps as part of the mutual TLS process. The next one is OF2. I still see services that still leverages that. For example, I see that a lot of times around gateway solutions. Like for example, I've seen some solutions that use like Apogee, and they use more of a token base like the OF2 OPAC token. And then I also see OpenID Connect, and this is where I see solutions where they leverage JWTs or JSON Web Tokens. And then last but not least, I've seen SPIF, where we actually have leveraged service mesh like Istios, where the interaction between the services are leveraging, like, just say this additional layer to basically propagate identity between the services. So let's go into some examples. So before I go into examples, let me actually set up the different scenarios. So the first scenario is the item on the left, where we have this existing monolith app. It's basically like a Tomcat app. It has the UI, it has the API business logic, and if you notice this last box at the bottom, it has the authentication management or system management. Okay, so this is a monolith, and it is using form-based authentication. Okay, now if I'm going through modernization, I basically want to support, for example, federated identity. I want to be able to support propagation of my identity to not just my app or my solution, but also to other applications as well. So in this new solution on the right-hand side, I'm basically going to use a OIDC component. So in this case here, I actually had two examples. I have one leveraging this IBM component called App ID, and I also have another solution where we're using Keycloak, and I'm going to show both. And actually, each one is using different technology as well. This picture basically represents, technology around Spring Boot, Node, Angular, and I believe that's it. And the other project is based on Keycloak, and it's based on Quarkus, and it's also based on Angular. Okay, so that's one of the demos. The other demos I'm going to showcase is the one about the certificates, and I'm actually going to showcase that one first. Okay, so a lot of times we talk about modernizing an existing application to a new one, like for example, in this case here, Microservice. Well, there's still scenarios where you still would have to talk to, like for example, either on-prem service or whatnot that's still based on, for example, SOAP. So what this picture represents is I have two services deployed. I have the service here. It's called Legacy Message Web Service. So this is basically a SOAP web service, and is using mutual TLS. Okay, because most time within our on-prem client environments, most of the services are fronted with like for example, a SOAP gateway, and it's probably using mutual TLS. So I basically want to simulate that same experience. The application on the left-hand side is called Legacy. Click on it. Legacy Messaging Wrapper. So in this case here, I'm saying this is a microservice, and it's basically talking to this legacy SOAP service. And the reason why I want to highlight this is because, if you remember earlier in my conversation, I basically mentioned that one of the biggest gripes around, like for example, those who are like directors or managers or whatever within the application field is, one of the problems that you say, well, this is not a problem we shouldn't have, because this is a certificate, has an expiration. Why can I get notified or basically, pre-plan to basically, renew, etc. But there's a lot of times when we don't, for various reasons, we don't renew in time, and we actually fall into an outage. So what we did was to basically mitigate that is we actually put a health endpoint so that we can actually retrieve, like in this case here, my legacy wrapper, basically my client. I basically want to understand like when does my certificate expire so that I can actually do a little bit more pre-planning on when do we need to actually renew. So in this case here, let me get my faithful notes and click on the link. So in this case here, I'm going to go to the certificate first. So right now the status is a warning, and it's because when I provision these certificates, I intentionally made them expire actually on the 1st, on April Fool's Day. So the gist is within my my parameters, I have it where within a certain amount of time, if it's just say it's within so many hours or so many days, to give a warning, and then if it's if it expired in a failure. So the gist is you could, instead of being reactive to a certificate expiring, you basically become more proactive. And we also put it on. We also use the help point to provide more of an informational view as well. So we're going to actually do this here. So here for informational point of view. So this basically gives me information for the key, since I'm doing mutual TLS, basically the certificate for my identity. And it also gives me the search expiration date for the cert that's coming from the server. So in this case here, like I said, instead of being reactive, it basically allows you to be more proactive in terms of accounting for that. So that's one. The second thing that I want to quickly showcase is, so when I first started with Spring Boot, they had the health endpoints turned on with the details without security turned on. And what that allowed a person to see is, for example, you see this information here in terms of like disk space, total, free, threshold. That's a security risk, because if I know how much space is on your, for example, your pod, your container, your OpenShift, not OpenShift, but like your PCF environment, your Pivotal environment, like your Cloud Foundry. If I'm a hacker, I can have to figure out that I can actually make it where I keep just say logs or whatever to basically spike, to basically use more disk space and keep monitoring and actually make it where I actually bring on the system. So the gist is, this is a security risk. So the gist is, you don't want to have you don't want to show this information without authentication. Now, the good news is within the latest frameworks, they do allow, it's basically secure by default. I just want to show this information as an example. Okay. So let's move to, let's do this. Okay. So from this picture, I've deployed this picture in this OpenShift environment. Here's my single page app called Modern UI. Here's my BFF. Here's my, just say my microservice, and here's my Keycloak that I deploy. Keycloak is basically my OpenID Connect server, okay? Now, what I'm gonna showcase is, what's gonna happen is when I perform authentication, it's basically gonna obtain a JOT token, and it's gonna propagate that token all the way to the microservice. So I'm gonna go to my link. I'm gonna log in. I think it's Sarah. Sarah. Hope it's Sarah. Nope. No, it's Alice. Okay, I've logged in. I'm going to click on details. I'm going to create a message. Okay, so that worked. So you may say, well, Jermaine, you can, how do I know, how do I know what's going on? You can easily make it where it's basically, unsecure from a back end point of view. So let's do this. We're gonna actually, I'm gonna move some things around so I can get to my tab. So we're gonna take this URL. We're gonna take this one. So this is the microservice. We're gonna open up the trusty postman. Okay. And let's see here, remote. I want to check the environment variables. Remote. Yep. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually make a call to create. So it should fail to get a 401. Yes. So we got a 401 unauthorized. So what we need to do is we need to authenticate. So here, I'll call this C and new access token. Use token. Okay. 204, it created. So I'm going to do a few again. So now when I call get messages, so we receive the messages. So if I go back here, so basically what it's doing is, if we go back to this picture, when we log in through the BFF. The BFF basically talks to the OIDC server. Then once we get the JOT, as it gets propagated back to just say the UI in a secure fashion. When I make a AJAX call, just say a REST call, just say the identity information is propagated along to the BFF here, and then that information basically that JOT is propagated on to the microservice. Now, we probably will have to have like secondary sessions to talk about, when do you use like a JWT based approach versus using more of a mutual TLS or maybe more of a service mesh, because there's certain scenarios where, for example, there's certain scenarios where they are significant pain points or to say lessons learned and gotchas, based on leveraging like JWT. But that's had to be a different session because there's different things like the DevOps stuff. There's things around availability. There's even things around a client. So, for example, if I have a client that's using JWT and just say that it basically using just say that the client profile, basically using ID, basically client ID and secret. Well, the thing that you run into is, how long does that token last? Is there some type of caching mechanism within the framework that you're leveraging to basically retrieve a token where every time you make a call to a backend, it's not basically pulling the token again? So different things like that, but we can have another follow-on session for that as well. So let me actually go to the other one. So really quick, so this solution here is based on, like I said, Keycloak is based on Quarkus, and it's based on Angular. Now let's look at the solution for Spring Boot. So we're gonna go to Chrome. And I want to go to, let me go to the page. And just an FYI, when we share this deck, there is a link to, there's a lab. There's a lab. It's called the App Security Lab, and it's part of IBM Open Lab, where you don't have to provision an environment. It basically includes the steps, and you basically just click on just like Windows, and the Windows basically propagate the terminal with the information, and it basically triggers the commands. So the gist is, I just deployed it via that same process. So what we're going to do is, okay. So here's the app within, so here's a lot of version of the app. So the previous app, we deployed our own OpenID Connect, OIDC. This solution, we leveraging one as a service. So we're basically leveraging OIDC as a service. So in this case here, we have our node, we have our BFF, we have our microservice. So I'm going to perform the same thing. Matter of fact, I'm just going to do it from here. And this is the one for, well, this is the one that's based on Spring and external, just say OIDC as a service. All right, that is, all right, so that's it. So let's do this. Let's open up for some questions, if you don't mind, Jason.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Jermaine. Right now, we actually don't have any questions. So if you guys have anything in particular that you wanted Jermaine to cover a little bit more detail, just please feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A section.
So let me ask a question. How many? I'm just going to do a probe. How many people are currently leveraging JSON Web Tokens as part of their solution?
You guys feel free to just put that in the chat if that's you. And Jermaine, just kind of FYI, so sometimes a lot of these attendees, they may not necessarily like be working on a specific project related to the topic as much as like they're just really looking into learning just for future projects that are maybe coming up.
Okay. So I'll tell you what, let's do this then. The only code that I have out available is the one for the security, the one for the open lab. So if you perform the lab, matter of fact, let me go there. So this is the open lab, and the lab that I'm referring to is the one called application security. This one. There is a Git repo for this. So this is actually the lab itself. So let me go to it. So the link is here. Okay. So let me show something in regards to the cert. And the reason why we did it because around the cert is because a lot of times when we do modernization, we're still talking to just say legacy components, and it's interesting just to say the word legacy when we talk about SOAP. But we still integrate into SOAP, and a lot of times those SOAP services are basically are secured by like sometimes they call it a functional account, or basically via like MTLS, or sometimes they say mutual SSL. So it just says, how do we integrate with that? Well, you say, well, we do that today. Why should it be hard? Well, it's not. But the thing that we want to account for is, when we get to the cloud, how do we make our solution more resilient? So the gist is, instead of making our solution more reactive based, we basically want to make it more proactive based. So we start thinking about in terms of, well, can we actually use health monitors to basically monitor the search as a secondary, task to make sure that we're basically monitoring if the cert expired, et cetera. So let me actually go to the piece of code. Legacy wrapper, and let's move this away. So basically what you're doing is you're basically leveraging the same process that you do to basically do like loading the key store, loading the trust store. The only thing that you're doing now is basically you getting the certificate from it as well, which is here. And we're also getting the date. So we're getting the certificate and we're also getting the date. And that's really it. And then the other thing that we're doing is just like in this case here, because we're leveraging Spring Boot, we're just leveraging the hooks, for health, just say health component or what they call endpoints. So here, you have like whatever your condition, in this case here for this lab, well, for this session, I basically, reduced it to like a few hours or say 24 hours. And here's just do a condition to see if it's within this condition, then throw a warning. If not, it basically keep the status as up. And the other one, just a info. So like if I want to check on the status without, going to like a status up page, because you got to remember when I showed go back to it. So once you turn user details off, you won't see this. So the only way you can really see like the details behind it is actually going to the informational page. But right now I have user details turned on. Okay. Is anyone? Go ahead.
Before you go further, so we got a question asking, how are we updating the certs proactively?
So this is where, so for the proactively, this is where you have to basically. It depends on your PKI solution or your certificate management solution that you have currently. So, for example, if your solution supports some type of APIs, you basically want to automate that process. Now, this is where it varies because sometimes, especially when you're dealing with security, they're very stringent in terms of just say integration. So just as you have to make sure that you basically define a process, but it just is you basically leverage your DevOps process to basically renew the certificates, just like if I was doing just say cloud certs, like the free ones. The other option is if you don't have APIs, where you have to basically do more of a manual step, you basically have to set up almost like a buffer, so much time, just say like 60 days. I'll just give an example, 60 days ahead of time before the cert expires. So at least to give you enough time for a manual process to basically renew the cert. Now, the other way, which is which I like about the latest version of Istio is Istio will basically renew the certs automatically. You may say, well, Jermaine, Istio been doing it for quite a while. Well, when you renew a cert for your application, you got to actually do like a restart most times, basically for that cert to basically take effect. One of the things I like about the latest version of Istio is they have this component called a cert manager, and it ties into just say the broader framework, and it have it where if the cert is renewed, that the application don't have to go through the process don't have to require like a restart. So the gist is your outages are actually minimized because what you're really trying to account for is how do you make your application more resilient? And you may say, well, I may deploy to multiple worker nodes. I may deploy to many nodes, many availability zones, etc. However, what about those what I call those lower infrastructure level services like your certs and whatnot? If you had to renew those, you may have to do a outage. But with the new process, if you're doing service mesh, you're able to basically take you're able to move that responsibility to someplace else where that's actually handled for you. Does that help?
Awesome. Thank you, Jermaine. If that Srikanth, I think I'm pronouncing that right. If that doesn't, if you still need a little bit more clarity, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll get Jermaine to elaborate a little bit more. And I think that's all the questions for now, Jermaine.
Sure.
Did you have anything else that you wanted to cover today, or does that kind of wrap it up from your end?
Well, I tell you what. Let me stop sharing. There is one. I may do another session. Just basically, give me 1 second. Wow. Okay. All right. All right. Let's share my screen. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
You can see it.
Okay. I probably may want to do another session on just say JWT alone because I see a lot of solutions that's using JWT, which is fine, but there's certain use cases where it's truly applicable and there's certain use cases where they're not. And a lot of my experience came about when I was actually a product owner for a just say a OIDC component. In other words, just like how I mentioned about Keycloak and the app ID, which is another OpenID component or product. I also was a product owner for one like that as well for clients, but we was basically looking at a very low latency component because the type of environment that we was in, we didn't really have the flexibility to use MTLS and some other technologies because of the point in time decision and where we were in terms of the technology wasn't mature enough. But it just is what I find a lot of times, for example, JWT, there's certain use cases where it's a fit. Like if you're doing end user, like end user security, like when I'm a user, I'm on a web page, I log in, and then I want to actually go to a different site. Great use case. Where you have to really evaluate if it's a right solution. If you're doing service to service security, in other words, like if I have a third party, or if I have like I said, like an accounting app, then I have a transfer app, because then you start looking at in terms of where's my single point of failure. How do I account for example, like DevOps, like example, if I have multiple teams doing microservices, well, that also means that you have to provision client IDs. So, is that an automated process where you can actually automate that? Then there's areas in terms of when I was talking about earlier around if my token only lasts for, like, for example, an hour, well, an hour suffice. For example, if that JOT component or that OIDC component go down, because you got to remember, if that component go down, there's no different than like if you go to a site. If that site authentication system goes down, you can't log in. Same thing would be applied if you're applying it to services. So you have to really look into what's the use cases, what's the the latency, response time, throughput, and all those things. But we can have another session on that.
Thank you, Jermaine. I think that, we'll definitely see what everyone thinks, and we may have you back on for go a little bit deeper on that.
Okay. All right. Well, that's it.
All right. Well, I think we answered all the questions. I don't see any more. And yeah, Srikanth said that you answered his question very well, so we're good to go there. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in and giving us your time. Jermaine, if anybody has any questions, is your contact information on the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else, any closing thoughts that you want to tell the audience, Jermaine?
Sure. I definitely want to thank those who joined us today. I do want to close with, in terms of for security, even if you're not a security SME, or maybe you're looking to become a security SME, I just recommend just remembering the CIA in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then just start from there.
Sounds really good. All right, guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day or your night. And until next time, bye.